little bit more into revenue recognition under ASC 606. ASC 606 has a 5-step process for a company to recognize revenue. Those 5 steps are: first, to identify the contract; second, to identify the performance obligation of that contract; third, to determine the transaction price; fourth, allocate the transaction price to the performance obligations; and 5, to recognize revenue. Now let's take a closer look at each of those steps. As I said, the first step is to identify the contract. First, we have to identify if a contract exists. A contract exists if collection of consideration is probable, it has commercial substance, the parties approve the contract and are committed to perform, and the rights to goods or services and payment terms can be identified. One criteria that was not stated is the contract has to be signed. While it is preferable to have a signed agreement does not have to be there for a contract to exist. Let's review step 2, to identify performance obligations. So if a contract includes multiple goods or services, we must identify how many of those are distinct. So performance obligations are distinct under 2 different criteria. First, the customer can benefit from the good or service on its own. And secondly, the good or service is separately identifiable from other promises in the contract. Just because 2 items are heavily dependent on one another does not necessarily mean they're distinct. Let's go through an example of this. We're going to use a software company. A software company is selling their implementation services, their software, as well as updates. The implementation services can be provided by other companies, and their updates are sold to existing customers. The fact that other companies can provide implementation services and updates are also provided to other customers means that there's 3 distinct pieces of this agreement. Let's switch this narrative a little bit. We're the same software company. The only difference is the implementation is custom. Since the implementation is custom, the implementation and the software itself are considered one obligation. The third step in the 5-step process under ASC 606 is to determine the transaction price. The transaction price is the amount of consideration to which an entity expects to be entitled in exchange for transferring goods or services to a customer, considering the following 4 components. The first we'll look at is variable consideration. This is the estimated amount to which the entity expects to be entitled, considering the risk of revenue reversal when making the estimate. Some examples of this include price concessions, rebates, and refunds, as well as contingency arrangements. There's 2 different methods under variable consideration. The first is the expected value approach and the most likely approach. The second component is the time value of money. For contracts with large financing arrangements, the transaction price has to be adjusted for the time value of money. The third consideration is non-cash consideration. Non-cash consideration must be measured at fair value. If it can't be estimated, use a standalone selling price for the good or service that was promised in exchange for that non-cash consideration. An example of this would be stock in lieu of compensation for a services contract. The last consideration within transaction price is consideration payable to a customer. This includes any cash an entity pays or expects to pay a customer. This may represent a reduction in transaction price. Step 4 is to allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation. Transaction price is allocated to each performance obligation. It must be in proportion to the standalone price, so the list price or the stated price. In the absence of a directly observable standalone price, the transaction price is estimated with one of the following 3 approaches. The adjusted market assessment approach, which is to evaluate the market in which the goods or services are sold and estimate the price that customers in that market would be willing to pay. You could also use the expected cost plus margin approach. This is to forecast the expected costs of satisfying the performance obligation and then applying a margin on top of that cost. The third is the residual approach, where you subtract the observable standalone selling prices of other goods or services provided in the contract from the total selling price. The fifth step is to recognize revenue. An entity recognizes revenue when it has satisfied a performance obligation by transferring a good or a service to a customer. This is either at a point in time, when, or over time, as. So a service or a good is considered transferred to the customer once that customer obtains control over it. Control refers to the customer's ability to direct the use of or obtain substantially all of the remaining benefit of an asset. I mentioned that revenue is either at a point in time when or over time as. Let's dive into that in a little bit more detail. Over time is when criteria for performance obligation is performed over a period of time. Examples of this include a lot of services, such as payroll services, cleaning services, and moving services. Criteria for a performance obligation satisfied at a point in time when include examples such as a customer has legal title to an asset, the customer accepts an asset, or the significant risks and rewards of ownership have been passed. We've now gone through the 5 steps of ASC 606 guidance. As a reminder, the 5 steps include identifying the contract, identifying the performance obligations, determining the transaction price, allocating the transaction price to performance obligations, and recognizing revenue.